Hey, hey. Ooh, are you a Republican? Are you a Democrat? Is it possible they could work together? Here's an example. Republicans and Democrats came together in Congress to allow medicinal marijuana for the purpose of relieving arthritis pain. So there's joint support for joints for joint support. Oh my gosh. We're doing our series on ungodly leaders. You're like, that is so bad. I agree. However, we have a really good episode for you. And the question I want you to think about is, what kind of hope exists when godless people are in leadership? Right? Ooh, think about that. The world history is replete, overflowing with examples of godless people. In our modern world, I would suspect that you and I might think of a few of the people in government might be godless.
What are you trying to say? No, nothing.
And I'm bringing that to your attention because there's an example in the Bible that I think would be very, very helpful to you, encouraging in your faith, that godless people in leadership, God can navigate that, right? So let's look at Cyrus. You're like, Cyrus, Cyrus. He was the king of Persia. Persia is what we know today as modern day Iran. And Cyrus was the king, and he was not a godly man. He wasn't believing in the God of Israel or any of that. However, it's interesting to think about, because Cyrus was moved by God to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And I bring this to your attention because what had happened up to this point, the Israelites had gone into exile, into captivity. They were living in Babylon, in Persia, modern day Iran. And there was a group of them, and they had been there now for a couple of decades. And Cyrus was the king of Persia, and God puts it in his heart to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Now, if you think about it, this is a Persian king rebuilding a Jewish temple. If we think about that in our modern world, that would seem very impossible, right? I mean, if you think about it, that would seem highly improbable. But this is exactly what God did. And I find that to be very powerful and very encouraging, because sometimes we look at the world around us, we look at the leaders, the world leaders, presidents, prime ministers, whoever you want to call them, and sometimes we can look at those individuals and think, oh my goodness, this is very discouraging. This is a very hopeless situation. And I suspect that the Jews in Persia at that time might have thought, oof, this is really discouraging, really hopeless. But Cyrus, God moved in Cyrus' heart to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. This took a little while, because it wasn't just like he woke up and then bam, suddenly happened instantaneously. That's not how it played out. He issued the decree, but then when the Israelites, the Jews, went back to rebuild the temple, there was problems. I mean, there was some significant problems and some significant opposition. And even over the course of Cyrus' reign, it didn't play out. It didn't happen. It wasn't until the next king, Darius, that the Israelites actually began and rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem, because of all of the opposition in Jerusalem, as well as some of the conflicts and miscommunication, all kinds of difficulties and hardships. But nevertheless, what I want to encourage you with is this, that there can be godless leaders. There can be trouble and all kinds of opposition and resistance to God, resistance to God's presence, God's power, God's priorities and values. But at the end of the day, God's purposes and plans still prevail, regardless of who the leader is or who the leader is not. God's purposes and plans still prevail, regardless of the opposition. In Jerusalem, there was tremendous opposition to rebuilding that temple. So much so that they intimidated people and they wrote letters back to the king in Persia. I mean, there was all kinds of opposition, resistance, and horrible pushback. But nevertheless, I just encourage you, God's purposes and plans prevail, no matter what the human efforts are. And I bring this to your attention because I believe this not only for leadership, but I want to encourage you in your own soul, in your own skin, that sometimes you go through valleys, dark experiences, and you know God's given you some plans and purposes, some promises, and it doesn't look like those would be true at all. Like it looks like the opposite of it, the burn down of all of it. However, I want to encourage you that even though we may not see it in the short run, the long run, the end game, the long game is that God's purposes and plans prevail no matter who is in leadership. So just be encouraged that with the election season that we're in right now, and all of the fray and all of the questions and the, this side and this side and this side and the independents and the Republicans and the Democrats, all those things that are just capturing all of our attention, and people are getting amped up and all of that stuff. Yeah, it's all in the feeds, it's all over our Instagram, it's all over our YouTubes, it's all over the news, it's all over Facebook, it's all the conversations. And it can be all of this human stuff. But let's appreciate that there is a God in heaven who is the divine designer. And thankfully, God is in charge. And we don't have to get anxious and chew our nails and get stressed out thinking what's going to happen, because ultimately God's plans and purposes prevail no matter what happens with humans, and no matter who's elected to be the president or who is not elected to be the president, who is in charge of the Senate, the majority leader, or who wins Congress. All these things, or what's going to happen with the Supreme Court justices, all that, all these things, the issues. And I'm not saying they're not important, but let's not make them more important or have our faith in all that stuff more than we have our faith and confidence in God. Because ultimately, God's plans and purposes prevail. So thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Hit the notification bell right there. We'll keep you posted with new content. Would love to have you subscribe, and love to have you pass this on to your friends, neighbors, relatives, because it's great content. And thankfully, I think there's some unifying stuff in here, regardless of your political persuasions. So thanks again. Catch you next week.